There is a mystery in the ancient days of Israel. A man born in weakness, hidden among the winepresses, threshing wheat in secret to survive the oppression of Midian. His name was Gideon. But when God called him, when the angel of the Lord appeared, he did not call him Gideon. He called him Mighty Warrior. And before this man could ever stand on the battlefield, before he could sound the trumpet to gather the tribes, he had to fight a battle in the night, in his own village, in his father's house. For in that place stood an altar to Baal, the god of the Canaanites, the god of the nations that surrounded them. And the command came from the Lord, tear it down, destroy the altar, cut down the Asherah pole beside it, build instead an altar to the God of Israel. Gideon obeyed. He did it under the cover of darkness, because fear still gripped his heart, yet obedience was stronger than his fear. And when the men of the town awoke and saw Baal's altar torn down, they wanted his life. They came to his father Josh and demanded, "Bring out your son that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal." But Josh stood and said, "If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself." And from that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend. Why is this in the word? Why did the Spirit choose to preserve this name? Because before you can stand against the enemies outside, you must confront the idols within. Before you can go to war with the darkness of the world, you must go to war with the darkness in your own house, your own heart, your own culture. Jerubbaal is the name given to the one who destroys the stronghold of the false gods and dares them to strike back. In the ancient world, Baal was the storm god, the fertility god, the bringer of rain, the giver of prosperity. But in truth, he was no god at all, only a spirit of deception, a principality that drew the people away from the living God into sin, bondage, and death. And the Word reveals that these gods are not myths, they are powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual forces in the heavenly realms. They once reigned over nations, and they seek to return. They change their names, they shift their masks, but their nature is the same. In the days of Gideon, Baal was worshipped on the high places of Israel. In our day, the high places may be the towers of our cities, the screens in our homes, the platforms of culture, the institutions that shape the hearts of men. The altars may not be of stone, but of ideology, entertainment, greed, lust, and pride. The Asherah poles may not stand in the fields, but they rise in the values and passions that replace the commandments of God. And still, the Spirit calls for Jerubbaals, men and women who will tear down the altars, even if it costs them their place in the village. Even if the crowd comes to their door. Your calling is not merely to live a quiet, safe life, but to confront the powers that destroy life. The idols of the ancient world brought the offering of children, the twisting of marriage, the celebration of sin as virtue. Do we not see the same in our day? The gods have returned, and they seek to reign over the land once more. But the call of Jerubbaal still goes forth to those willing to say, "Let them contend." To those who will tear down the altar in the night, so that in the morning the people will see there is another way, another God, the only true God. You may say, "I am the least, I am not strong, I have no power." But neither did Gideon. The power was never in the man, it was in the one who called him. And if the one who called you is the Lord, then your weakness is only the vessel for his strength. The gods of this age are loud, but they are not omnipotent. They can roar, but they cannot stand before the name of the Lord. If Baal is a god, let him contend. But he will not, for he is nothing before the Almighty. So rise, a mighty warrior. Rise, Jerubbaal. Your calling is to bring down the altars, to challenge the gods of this age, to stand when all others bow. For the battle is the Lord's, and he is calling you now. If you want, I can also give you 6 prophetic keynotes from this speech, so each can be expanded into full Jonathan Cahn style segments. Would you like me to prepare those next? Before Gideon could raise a sword, before he could summon an army, before he could step onto the battlefield, the Lord gave him an assignment that seemed far removed from war. It was not to charge into the enemy's camp, but to go to his own father's property, to his own village, and destroy the altar to Baal that stood there. This was not in Midianite territory. This was not in a foreign city. This was in Israel. The altar was not in the land of strangers. It was in the heart of God's people. And this reveals something deep. God's deliverance doesn't begin on the outside, it begins on the inside. Before victory is seen against the armies outside your gates, it must be won over the strongholds within your own walls. When God calls you, he does not start by pointing you at distant enemies. He begins by pointing you to what is close, to what is familiar, to the hidden idols that dwell unnoticed in the house you've lived in all your life. For Gideon, it was the altar of Baal in his father's yard. For you, it may not be a carved stone altar, but it could be a habit, a compromise, a thought pattern, a way of living that has become so normal you no longer notice it opposes God. It could be in your heart, your family, your relationships, or your culture. The altar to Baal represented a false source of provision, security, and identity. The people turned to Baal for rain, for crops, for prosperity. They looked to a counterfeit instead of the living God. In the same way, anything in your life that you trust more than God, anything you go to for peace, comfort, identity, or strength before you go to Him becomes an altar, and the call of God will always confront these first. It would have been easier for Gideon to ignore the altar and simply focus on the Midianites. After all, they were the obvious threat. But God knew that if the altar to Baal remained standing, even if Midian was driven away, Israel would still not be free. They would simply fall into bondage again, because the root of their oppression was not Midian, it was idolatry. The same is true for you. The most obvious problem in your life may not be the deepest one. The greatest battle may not be with the visible crisis, but with the invisible loyalties of your heart. And here is the challenge. Tearing down what is in your own house will almost always cost you more than fighting an external enemy. You may face misunderstanding, rejection, or even hostility from those closest to you. Gideon knew the people of his own town might turn against him, and they did. But God will not send you into the public battle until you have been faithful in the private one. Victory in the open begins with victory in the secret place. This is why God calls you first to confront the idols that no one else sees. It is not because He wants to shame you, but because He wants to set you free completely. You cannot carry the sword of the Lord in one hand and hold on to Baal's altar with the other. The two cannot coexist. When you destroy the altar in your own yard, you declare that the God you serve is not just the God of your victories, but the God of your heart, your home, and your life. So when God calls you, be ready for Him to point first to the altar that stands close by. Don't rush past it. Don't excuse it. Don't wait for a more convenient time. Tear it down, no matter the cost. Because only when the altar in your own house has fallen can you stand strong to face the enemies beyond it. That is where every true calling begins, with the courage to confront what is nearest before conquering what is far. When the command of God came to Gideon to destroy the altar of Baal, fear was not absent from his heart. He did not stride into the daylight with bold declarations for all to hear. Instead, he obeyed under the cover of night when the eyes of men were shut. And yet, the Scriptures do not condemn him for this. The Spirit records not his perfect courage, but his faithful obedience. For in the kingdom of God, it is obedience that matters more than the feeling of fear. Many imagine that they must wait until all fear is gone before they can obey, but Gideon's story tells us otherwise. You can obey God even while trembling. When the men of the town discovered what he had done, their anger burned. This altar was not just a pile of stones, it represented a way of life, a shared devotion, and in their minds, an assurance of prosperity. Gideon's act was not just an act of destruction, it was a declaration that the God they had trusted was false. And such declarations will always stir opposition. The people rose up to demand his life. They were willing to kill him to defend their God. This is the cost of obedience. Sometimes it places you in direct conflict with those who are bound to what you must tear down. But here the mystery unfolds. Gideon's father Josh, who had himself been the keeper of that altar, stood in his defense. He told the people, "If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself." Josh had lived with that altar for years, but the act of his son shook something within him. Perhaps it awakened long-forgotten memories of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Perhaps it stirred shame for what had been allowed to stand in his house. Whatever the cause, Gideon's obedience inspired a defense from the very one who had been aligned with the idol. This reveals something vital. Your obedience can have an impact far beyond what you see. You may act in fear, in weakness, in the quiet of the night, and yet your stand can awaken others to the truth. The courage you long for often grows in the soil of small, trembling acts of faith. God is not waiting for you to feel fearless. He is calling you to trust Him enough to move forward, even when fear still clings to you. In our lives, the call to tear down altars may not involve physical stones, but it will involve dismantling things people hold sacred. not because they are holy, but because they have placed their trust in them. You may be called to challenge a tradition, confront a compromise, expose a deception, or renounce something that the crowd has embraced. And when you do, you can expect the crowd's hostility. But the question is never, will they be angry? The question is, will I obey? A fear tells you to protect yourself, to avoid conflict, to stay hidden. Obedience tells you to honor God above all else. Gideon's obedience, though done in the shadows, became a public testimony. His new name, Jerubbaal, let Baal contend, was a badge of defiance against the false god, and with that act his calling was set in motion. The lesson is this: God does not require you to be without fear, He requires you to be faithful in spite of it. You may take your first steps in the dark, but as you move, the light will grow. What matters is not the size of your courage at the start, but the size of your obedience. For when you choose to obey, you invite the power of the Almighty into your weakness, and it is there that fear begins to lose its hold. The scriptures tell us that when Israel turned from God to the worship of Baal and Asherah, they were not simply bowing before stone and wood. The word reveals that behind the idols of the nations were real spiritual entities, rulers of darkness, principalities that held sway over peoples and lands. The prophets spoke of them as false gods, but the New Testament unveils their true nature, powers and principalities in the heavenly realms, to the same that Paul spoke of when he said, "We wrestle not against flesh and blood." These beings were not the inventions of primitive minds, they were the fallen ones, spirits of deception that enticed nations away from the living God. In ancient times they were called by names like Baal, Molech, Ashtoreth. In other lands, they wore other names and faces, but they were the same in essence. In the days of Gideon, Baal was the face of a covenant-breaking spirit. He was worshipped as the storm god, the bringer of rain and harvest, the guarantor of fertility and prosperity. But in truth, he was a counterfeit provider, luring Israel to abandon the God who had brought them out of Egypt. And the tragedy is that Israel did not see this as rebellion, they saw it as practical. They believed that by honoring Baal, they would secure their crops and their future. This is the subtlety of the gods. They offer what seems useful, even beneficial, but in exchange they bind you with chains you cannot see. These ancient powers did not die when the idols fell. When a nation turns away from God, when a culture empties itself of the presence of the Holy One, the house does not remain empty for long. The spirits return, wearing new masks, speaking in new languages, adapting to the customs of the age. What was once a carved image may now be an ideology. What was once a sacrifice on an altar may now be a sacrifice in the name of progress, convenience, or self-fulfillment. The forms change, but the powers are the same. In our modern age, many scoff at the idea of gods and idols, believing such things to be relics of a superstitious past. Yet the worship of false gods is everywhere. In the worship of self, in the pursuit of pleasure at all costs, in the enthronement of human desire as the highest law. The gods of ancient times promised freedom, but delivered bondage. They promised life, but dealt in death. And so it is now. The same spirits that once demanded offerings of children in the high places now manifest in different ways. Yet the fruit is the same: the destruction of life, the breakdown of family, the perversion of truth. To understand your calling, you must see this reality. Your battle is not against the visible enemies, not ultimately against governments, leaders, movements, or individuals. It is against the powers that animate them, the ancient forces that whisper lies into the ears of men. This is why the call of Jerubbaal is so critical. To stand against the false gods is to stand against the powers behind them. And you cannot defeat them in your own strength. You must stand in the authority of the one who is above every principality and power. The gods of this world seek to return, to reclaim the high places, to once again rule over the minds and hearts of people. But as in the days of Gideon, God is raising up those who will not bow, who will recognize the enemy behind the mask, who will tear down the altar and declare, "Let them contend." Your calling is not only to see the idols for what they are, but to see the powers behind them, and to take your stand in the victory of the cross, where every one of them was disarmed and put to open shame. That is the fight you are called into, the ancient battle that continues in our day. In Gideon's day, the high places stood visible on the hills and in the groves. Stone altars to Baal, wooden poles to Asherah, places where the people would go to bow down, offer sacrifices, and seek blessings from gods that were no gods at all. These were physical structures you could touch, see, and walk around. But the reality of our day is that the altars have gone underground, not buried in the earth, but hidden in plain sight. They are no longer built of stone stacked in fields, but of ideas, habits, systems, and desires. The modern Asherah pole may not stand in a sacred grove. It may stand in the center of your living room, glowing with moving images. The altar may be a place on a screen where the culture teaches what to love, what to hate, what to desire, and what to believe. In the ancient world, the altar was the place of exchange. You gave something valuable in order to receive something you wanted. That reality has not changed. People still give their time, their energy, their affections, and even their children's hearts to the gods of this age in exchange for promises of security, identity, pleasure, and power. The form is different, but the function is the same. What is trending, what is celebrated, what is exalted in our world often reveals where the altars are. They stand in the entertainment industry, in politics, in academia, in the marketplace, in the ideologies that redefine truth, life, and morality. These altars are powerful because they blend into the ordinary. A pagan shrine in ancient Israel was easy to identify, but a cultural altar today might look like a harmless pastime or a common opinion. Yet beneath the surface, it operates with the same goal: to replace the authority of God with something else. In Gideon's day, the people still claimed to belong to Yahweh, but they also gave their worship to Baal. They mixed the worship of the true God with the practices of the nations. This mixture was the very thing that weakened them and opened the door for Midian to oppress them. So it is now. The blending of faith in God with the values of the world is a modern altar that must be torn down. The Asherah poles of today are erected in the hearts of people through repetition, influence, and the slow erosion of conviction. The images and messages are planted and nurtured until they grow into beliefs that stand in opposition to God's word. And when the moment comes to choose between obedience to God and loyalty to those beliefs, the altar demands its sacrifice. That is why the call to be a Jerubbaal is urgent in our time. To confront a modern altar is to challenge the cultural narrative. It is to say that not everything celebrated by the world can be embraced by the people of God. It is to take a stand in places where compromise has become the norm. This is not a call to wage war against people, but against the deception that has ensnared them. It is a call to speak truth where lies have taken root, to live in holiness where sin is applauded, and to demonstrate the freedom of God's ways where bondage has been disguised as liberty. The enemy knows that if the altar stands, the people will remain bound, no matter how many outward victories they seem to win. That is why the tearing down must happen first in your own life, then in your home, and then in the sphere God has given you. Modern altars may not look dangerous, but their effect is the same as in Gideon's day. They turn hearts from the living God. And so, to answer your calling, you must see them clearly, refuse to bow, and in the authority of God, bring them down. When God called Gideon, Gideon's first response was not confidence. He did not see himself as a warrior or a leader. He saw himself as the least in his family, from the smallest clan in Manasseh. His words to the angel of the Lord were filled with doubt and self-awareness of his weakness. And yet, God's answer was simple and profound. I will be with you. This is the foundation of every true calling, not the strength of the one called, but the presence of the one who calls. Your weakness is not a disqualification. In the kingdom, it is often the very thing that makes you usable. The battle against the gods of this age is not won by natural power, persuasive skill, or human resources. It is fought in the Spirit, and the Spirit does not require the vessels to be impressive by human standards. In fact, God delights to use what the world considers weak, small, or foolish to shame the strong and confound the wise. Gideon's own journey would prove this. With a small and seemingly inadequate force, God would bring down the armies of Midian so that the glory would belong to him alone. When you know your weakness, you are far less likely to steal the glory. You are less tempted to believe that victory came because of your own cleverness or strength. Weakness keeps you dependent. It drives you to pray more, to listen more closely, to move only when God directs. It strips away the illusion of self-sufficiency and forces you to anchor yourself in God's sufficiency. This is why your inadequacies, your limitations, your lack of resources are not obstacles in His plan. They are tools in His hands. The gods of this world are bold and loud, confident in their grip on culture and hearts. They demand attention and promise power to those who bow. Facing them with only your natural ability will leave you outmatched. But when you go in the name of the Lord, your weakness becomes a channel for His strength. The same power that spoke the universe into existence, that parted the Red Sea, that raised Christ from the dead, works through the surrendered vessel who trusts in Him. This is the lesson of Gideon's threshing floor moment. The call came when he was hiding from the enemy, doing his work in secret. God did not wait until Gideon had transformed into a fearless warrior. He called him as he was and promised to make him into what he needed to be. The same is true for you. God does not wait for you to become strong enough. He calls you now in the middle of your weakness and says, "Go in the strength you have." Because the strength you have is not the strength you will rely on. His presence will be your strength. It is easy to believe that weakness means you are unqualified. But in the pattern of Scripture, weakness is often the very evidence of God's choice. Moses stuttered, David was overlooked, Jeremiah thought himself too young, Peter was impulsive, Paul was afflicted with a thorn in the flesh. Yet in each case, God's power was made perfect in weakness. The glory of the victories they experienced could never be attributed to their natural ability. It could only be traced back to God. So when you hear the call to be a Jerubbaal, do not look first at your limitations. Look at the one who calls you. Your weakness is not a liability in His plan. It is the very condition in which His power can be most clearly revealed. If you feel unready, unworthy, or unable, you are in the perfect place for His strength to work. For the battle is not yours, it belongs to the Lord, and He delights to win it through those who know they cannot win it on their own. The name Jerubbaal was not a title Gideon chose for himself. It was given to him after he tore down the altar of Baal. It was a name that carried both defiance and challenge. Let Baal contend. It was a public declaration that if this so-called God had any power, he could strike back. But Baal could do nothing, for he was nothing before the Lord. That name became Gideon's identity in the eyes of the people, marking him as the one who dared to stand against the God they had served. In that moment, Gideon crossed a line. There was no going back to anonymity, no fading into the background. He had become a living challenge to the false god, and from that moment, his calling to stand against the powers of darkness was sealed. The same is true for you. When you take your stand for the truth of God, when you refuse to bow to the gods of the age, you become a living challenge to them. Your life becomes a testimony that exposes their emptiness. You may not receive a new name as Gideon did, but you will be marked. People will know you as the one who does not compromise, the one who will not worship at the altar of popular opinion, the one who belongs fully to the Lord. That stand will make you visible, and it will draw both opposition and respect. The call of Jerubbaal is not simply to resist in private, but to stand openly when the moment demands it. The gods of this age thrive in silence, in the absence of confrontation, in the willingness of God's people to let their altars remain untouched. But when you challenge them, not with arrogance, but with the authority of God, you force the issue. You bring into the light what has been hidden. You declare by word and by life that there is only one true God and He will not share His glory. This is not a comfortable calling. To challenge the gods of the age is to challenge the culture that serves them. It is to live in such a way that your loyalty to God is unmistakable. It is to risk misunderstanding, rejection, and even hostility. Yet, it is also to walk in the power and protection of the one who is greater than every false god. For when you stand as Jerubbaal, you are not standing alone. Heaven stands with you. The Lord Himself takes up your cause. We live in a time when the ancient gods have returned in modern form. They no longer bear the names Baal or Asherah, but their influence is visible everywhere, in the exaltation of self, in the twisting of truth, in the sacrifice of what is holy for what is convenient or profitable. They demand allegiance and they punish dissent. Yet, the call to God's people is the same as it was in Gideon's day: tear down the altars, stand against the gods, and let them contend if they dare. Your calling is not to blend in with the crowd, but to be set apart, to be a visible sign that there is another way, another kingdom, another king. Every time you refuse to bow to the pressures of compromise, every time you speak truth in love, every time you live in holiness before a watching world, you are fulfilling the call of Jerubbaal. You are declaring to the gods of the age, if you have power, show it, knowing full well that they have none before the living God. This is the hour for such a stand. The battle lines are drawn, the idols are exalted, and the world waits to see if there are still those who will not bow. May you be one of them. May your life be the altar torn down and the testimony raised up, so that all may know that the Lord alone is God.